My friends, what you are about to discover now is not just a commercial development. It's the anatomy of a documented national betrayal. The United States government has just officially imposed a devastating 25% tariff on the overwhelming majority of Brazilian imports. The steel hammer forged in Washington has come down on the backbone of our productive sector. But while thousands of Brazilian entrepreneurs, producers, and workers watch the imminent collapse of their production lines, a single family with shady connections deep within Brasilia operated in the shadows of the American capital to ensure their own survival. We are facing what I call the silver lifeboat syndrome. The logic is cruel but brilliantly perverse. The federal government deliberately sabotages the hull of the Brazilian economic ship to force the crew to depend on its political crumbs. But the king's billionaire friend doesn't despair or attempt to repair the ship. He goes to the basements of Washington, buys the only silver-plated lifeboat, and watches from his armored box seat as the economy class passengers sink into darkness. And to understand how this lifeboat was bought, we need to follow the money trail to K Street, the epicenter of the military lobby. Millionaire in Washington, D.C. JBS, controlled by brothers Joesley Batista and Wesley Batista, assembled a task force of political mercenaries to shield their meat empire from Donald Trump's sanctions. Official documents from the U.S. Congress reveal that the company injected more than $500,000, equivalent to 2.5 million reais, just in lobbying fees in the last few weeks. They didn't hire ordinary lawyers. They bought direct access to the veins of American power. The list of lobbyists funded by the Batistas includes Carla Tanman, former chief of staff at the United States Department of Agriculture, Allison Crittenden, former legislative assistant in the Chamber of Deputies, and Shane Dennison, former director of global programs at the USDA itself. They rented the brains and the schedule of those who wrote the rules of the American game. But understand one thing, lobbying is not a crime, it's not illegal in the United States. But here comes the irony that reaches toxic levels. Think about the figure of Joesley Batista. We're talking about the man who confessed on national television during Operation Car Wash to having paid millions in direct bribes to the campaigns of Lula and Dilma Rousseff. A man whose freedom and that of his brother was guaranteed by rulings from the Superior Court of Justice. A corporation that was investigated under the U.S. Section 301 investigation for practices analogous to slavery. And that became obscenely rich, using BNDES as its own personal ATM. In the era of PT's national champions, operating even in Venezuela's bloody dictatorship with the approval of the Brazilian government, whenever the Planalto Palace feels cornered, the Batista name resurfaces. More than 20 years of symbiosis with those in power guaranteed them an incalculable fortune. They even offered millions and millions to monopolize rare earth mining in Brazil as a diplomatic bargaining chip with Trump. They are willing to do absolutely anything to keep the left-wing machine running in Brazil. But this time, the diplomatic bill came for the rest of the country. JBS decided to save only its own skin. While the Batistas were buying their free pass, the Brazilian government was taking a diametrically opposite stance. And this is where naivety needs to end, but pay attention. You won't understand the gravity of this million-dollar lobby in Washington until you know about the nuclear bomb that Marco Rubio just dropped on Lula and the entire Brazilian left. And it's exactly to decode this level of geopolitical chess that the system tries to hide from you that our community has become the biggest force on the internet. And I'm running for the iBest award in the political influencer category, and we need to show the establishment the full weight of our elite. I'm asking for your vote now. The link is in the description and in the first pinned comment. Go there, vote, and prove that our voice cannot be silenced. We've already been in first place for a week and made it into the top 10 today. We're in 5th place in the national ranking. This is our true strength. We're competing against the other side, against the enemies of freedom. against the enemies of Brazil, against the true lovers of dictatorships and of communism and socialism that are trying to dominate our nation. So my friends, this vote is very important. Now, the American Secretary of State Marco Rubio issued a statement that echoed like a nuclear detonation in the halls of Itamaraty. In an official statement, Rubio pointed his finger at the Planalto and named the real culprit for the tariff hike. President Lula and his government did not negotiate in good faith with the United States. Lula put his ego ahead of making the deal for the good of Brazilians and Americans. The blunt translation of that phrase in the language of geopolitics means that Brazilian diplomacy is dead. When Washington uses the legal term bad faith, they are documenting that Brazil went to the negotiating table with the premeditated intention of sabotaging the deal. But why would a president actively work to have his own country hit with a 25% sanction? The answer is purely electoral. The Lula administration wants the forced closure of the economy. With export channels blocked by Trump's tariffs, Brazilian producers are forced to flood the domestic market with products. And at first, this causes an artificial drop in shelf prices, holding down inflation by choking the market. It's the perfect scenario for the political theater of the 2026 elections. Food supposedly gets cheaper for a short period. Why? Because they no longer sell abroad, while the blame for international isolation is shifted to the imperialism of Donald Trump. Do you see the move? Make the products cheaper, make the picanha cheaper. But hold on, the picanha won't get cheaper, and I'll tell you why. Because there's a problem with this irresponsible alchemy. It destroys the future. When the international profit margin disappears, the national producer simply stops investing, stops planting, shuts down the machines, and lays off workers en masse. Brazil sacrifices its industrialization and its advanced agribusiness for a magic trick that doesn't last through a full election cycle. Argentina under Alberto Fernandez did exactly the same thing, and the result was absolute misery. Were they eating dogs? And to prove that the American retaliation was not a whim, the United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer published the final document detailing the reasons for the tariff hike. And pay attention, you'll understand that what Lula wants to make cheaper, the famous picanha, is not going to get cheaper. The report is a relentless autopsy of Brazilian institutions. It shatters and destroys the Brazilian narrative on three surgical fronts that the mainstream media is desperate to hide from you. First, the environmental farce and forced protectionism. The current government has spent the last few years traveling to Europe to sell the image of defenders of the Amazon. But the American report shatters this fiction with raw data. The document states that 91% of the deforestation between 2023 and 2024 was purely illegal logging. For Washington, this is not just an ecological problem, it's environmental dumping. They claim that this illegal wood unfairly cheapens Brazilian timber, destroying the competitiveness of the United States timber industry. And the result? The Brazilian timber sector was hit with a 25% surcharge. But here comes the contrast of privilege that defines today's Brazil. While the timber sector is being crushed, the 2.5 million reais lobbying by the Batista brothers ensured that beef was surgically removed from the list of penalties. There will be no picanha. Look at how perverse that is. Joesley didn't use former United States government officials to save Brazilian agribusiness. He bought special protection only for the JBS protein empire, leaving the rest of the productive sector adrift in the ocean of tariffs. Second, the systemic corrosion of justice and the commercial imbalance. The document specifically mentions Dias Toffoli, a Supreme Court justice, and the recent judicial maneuvers. The Americans officially declare that Brazil has regressed decades in the fight against corruption, focusing exclusively on rehabilitating those convicted in the Lava Jato operation so they could return to the centers of power. Look, even the Batista brothers. They understood how Brazil worked and gave their verdict. Brazil no longer has legal certainty. Yeah, Greer goes further, exposing the tariff hypocrisy of Brasilia. The report details that Brazil gave preferential treatment and lowered taxes for countries like India and Mexico while maintaining very high barriers against the United States. The example cited is devastating. Brazilian tariffs on American technology are prohibitive. Any Brazilian who tries to buy an iPhone knows they pay 3 times the price because of this tax barrier. As retaliation, Brazilian ethanol was also targeted. It's a direct response to the tariffs that President Lula's government imposed to block American fuel. Is this total isolation due to diplomatic incompetence? But it's the third point that sets off this crisis. The war against digital freedom? Jameson Greer's document exposes the secret orders issued by the Supreme Federal Court led by Alexandre de Moraes. Picture how technically serious this situation is. Washington documented that the Brazilian courts demanded that global conglomerates like X, Meta, and Google remove political content without due process. And even worse, they forbade the platforms from revealing these orders to the public. When Brazil blocked X and suspended Rumble, it not only censored Brazilians, it imposed million-dollar fines on American companies and prevented communication from residents of the United States. For Washington, this constitutes a direct foreign attack on free digital trade in the United States. The Lula government had a golden opportunity to negotiate the restoration of freedom of speech in exchange for ending the tariffs, but they constantly refused. They preferred to let your cell phone, your machines, and your supplies become 25% more expensive rather than give up the control apparatus operated by the Supreme Federal Court. The authoritarian ego of Brasilia and the protection of the king's friends cost the future of thousands of national industries. And don't be fooled by the smokescreen from Brazil's foreign ministry that tried to blame Trump's ideological polarization. No. Brazil's isolation is a global symptom. At the same time that the United States brought down the hammer, China, supposedly a strategic ally of the current government, also imposed punitive tariffs on Brazilian beef. The European Union activated protocols blocking our exports due to failures by the Brazilian government in delivering basic documentation. The whole world is shutting its doors to Brazil. Not because the world hates Brazil, but because Brazil, under this administration, has become a radioactive, unstable, and ideologically vengeful trading partner. And so that we can track who made it to the core of this analysis and understood the real power game between the Planalto and the billionaire friends of the king, go to the comments now and type our keyword for today. Our final verdict, so that the system understands that we know how to read the map. Now write in all caps the silver boat and diplomatic bad faith. These 2 words. Type this to show the algorithm that our community sees through fraudulent narratives. I repeat. Silver boat and diplomatic bad faith. And pay attention. Pay close attention to what this means for your own reality. Those who don't understand this narrative game, who don't know how to position themselves, are always the first to sink while others board the silver boat. The market acts exactly like geopolitics. It mercilessly punishes those who lack authority and don't know how to communicate. Today, the most valuable currency on the planet is not oil. It's not gold. It's not diamonds. It's attention. For you, entrepreneur or high-level professional, the greatest pain is being the best at what you do and still remaining invisible. You have a spectacular business, but you feel like the algorithm only rewards trivial things and dancing, while those with serious content disappear. And that's a lie. And I just proved it to you. 15 years ago, when I started in radio and TV, I understood that building real authority requires a war strategy. Anyone who wants to be recognized today needs to accept an irreversible fact. Every business has become a media business. Look at CIMED, for example. A pharmaceutical company that became a content machine to triple sales and break through the bubble. Look at Luciano Hang of Havan. Since he put himself out there on the internet, he hasn't stopped opening stores, controlling his own narrative and winning the hearts of the Brazilian people. Well, the owner needs to put himself out there and guide the company's vision. But the days of recording with your phone any old way and thinking that's going to make you dominate your sector are over. Digital today demands killer professionalism. If you want to gain unquestionable authority, attract clients who don't haggle over price, and build a strong business, even monetized in dollars. By applying the exact method that guarantees me over 50 million views every month on my social media, you need to take control. That's why on August 16th, I'll be holding a 100% in-person immersion locked in with me at my studio in Curitiba, and I'll personally guide you in aggressively building your authority. But I'm strict with the numbers. There are only 10 seats. When the 10th spot is taken, the steel door closes and that's it. Well, QR code on the screen, the secure link is in the description and in the first pinned comment. Secure your spot and break out of the bubble that's holding you back. Get out of obscurity and bulletproof your communication. Now, for those of you who waste a lot of time looking for a good movie or series to watch with your family over the weekend, we've solved your problem. We've solved that problem for you, that's right. Our channel with series and movie tips brings you a curated selection where you just click and make better use of your time. I've wasted many hours myself looking for a good title, only for it to end up being complete garbage. Link in the description, in the pinned comment, and in the card that will appear on your screen. So what will be the next step that Lula will take in this war he's fighting with Donald Trump? Rate it for us from 0 to 10. How do you feel about the Brazilian government today? Do you approve of Lula's actions or do you disapprove? Now subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and like the video because it takes a lot of work to make. My friends, blind shield your mind. I'm Shimon Oliveira and I'll see you in the next video. See you then.